If you think Cointelpro sounds like a conspiracy theory, you're already off to a bad start, because this one is real. It was created by the FBI, it operated for years, and it targeted Americans in the name of national security. This is not a story built on internet rumors. This one comes with paperwork. Cointelpro stands for Counterintelligence Program. It began in 1956, and it was not one single mission. It was a category of secret programs designed to monitor, infiltrate, disrupt, and discredit groups the government considered dangerous. The problem is, the definition of dangerous did not stay small. To understand why Cointelpro existed, you have to understand the Cold War mindset. In the 1950s and 60s, communism was not treated like an argument you debate. It was treated like a contagious threat, something that could spread inside the country, inside unions, inside universities, inside civil rights groups, inside protest movements. And once a government decides dissent might be subversion, the enemy list tends to grow. That is the danger. Not that every investigation begins as tyranny, but that fear gives institutions permission to stretch the rules. And bureaucracies get surprisingly creative when fear comes with a budget. Early Cointelpro efforts focused on the Communist Party, but the program expanded. Civil rights groups, black nationalist organizations, socialist groups, anti-war movements, student organizations, and what the FBI called the New Left. In other words, this was not just about catching spies. It became a tool for managing domestic political unrest. For years, most Americans knew almost nothing about it. Then, on March 8, 1971, a group of activists broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania. They stole files and mailed them to journalists. Inside those files was a name the public was not supposed to know: Cointelpro. That break-in did not just expose a secret program, it opened a bigger question. How far can a government go behind closed doors? When it decides political movements are a problem to be solved? So, how did Cointelpro work? Not with one dramatic movie moment. That is the misleading part. Most government power does not look dramatic while it is happening. It looks boring, administrative, routine. A memo, a phone call, a file, a meeting, a quiet instruction passed down the chain. Cointelpro worked through smaller tactics: surveillance, informants, anonymous letters, reputation attacks, pressure on employers, pressure on landlords, pressure on universities, and carefully timed leaks or rumors. Often, the goal was not prosecution. The goal was confusion, division, fear, and exhaustion, which, if we are being honest, is a very efficient way to weaken a movement without officially banning it. First, surveillance. This meant collecting information, tracking people, photographing meetings, monitoring communications, building files on private lives, political activity, friendships, and associations. Surveillance is not neutral when the target knows it may be used against them. It changes behavior. People start wondering who is watching, who is listening, who can be trusted. Then came infiltration. Informants were one of the key tools. Some informants gathered information, others helped deepen mistrust and internal conflict. If a group already had rivalries, ideological splits, or leadership disputes. Outside interference could widen those cracks fast. You do not always have to destroy an organization directly, if you can encourage it to implode. Another tactic was anonymous letters and fake communications. The purpose was not subtle. It was to create suspicion, damage relationships, break alliances, provoke conflict inside political groups. Basically, psychological warfare with typewriters and filing cabinets. It is hard to build a movement when half your energy is spent wondering who is a traitor. And Cointelpro did not operate in a vacuum. The tactics work together. Information gathering feeds intimidation. Intimidation feeds paranoia. Paranoia feeds internal conflict. And internal conflict does the job for you. That is why the word disruption matters. Cointelpro was not just watching, it was designed to disrupt. Now, there were many targets and many cases, but one of the most infamous targets was Martin Luther King Jr. The FBI monitored him intensely and attempted to discredit him. This is where a comforting myth collapses. The idea that government overreach only targets fringe extremists. King was not a nobody. He was one of the most important civil rights leaders in American history. And still, he became a target of surveillance and intimidation tactics. That matters, because if the state can frame a civil rights leader as a threat, then the line between security and political control becomes dangerously thin. Another major focus was the Black Panther Party. The FBI viewed black nationalist movements as a serious internal threat, and Cointelpro tactics were used to weaken them. Infiltration, disinformation, amplifying internal conflict, feeding law enforcement pressure. This part matters because it shows how political policing and fear can reinforce each other. Once a movement is labeled dangerous, every aggressive tactic becomes easier to justify. Every file looks necessary. Every informant looks practical. Every abuse starts sounding like prevention. That is how security language becomes political cover. Cointelpro also targeted student groups and anti-war activists. In the 1960s, protest movements grew fast. Civil rights protests, anti-war marches, student organizing, campus activism. To the state, that kind of movement can look like instability. But in a democracy, mass protest should not automatically be treated as an enemy operation. It should be treated as a warning sign, a sign that something in the country is unresolved. So why was all of this possible? Because fear makes governments aggressive, because secrecy makes institutions comfortable, and because oversight is weak when the public cannot see what is happening. Cointelpro was not just a rogue impulse, it was a mindset built out of national anxiety, political power, institutional secrecy, and the habit of doing things quietly. Once covert tactics become normal, they stop feeling extraordinary, they feel operational. That may be the most disturbing part. Not that someone wakes up and says, "Let us violate democracy today," but that each step can be explained as necessary. Just one more file, just one more source, just one more letter, just one more operation. And then, years later, the country looks back and realizes the exception became a system. Public exposure eventually led to broader scrutiny. In the mid-1970s, the United States Senate's Church Committee investigated abuses by intelligence agencies. Those investigations confirmed a wider pattern. Surveillance and political interference had gone further than Americans had been told. This is the part where the system has to sit down and read its own paperwork out loud, which is always awkward, but still better than pretending the paperwork does not exist. Now let us separate what is documented from what gets exaggerated. Documented. Cointelpro existed. The FBI ran it. It targeted domestic groups and it used disruption tactics, surveillance, infiltration, anonymous communications, disinformation, and pressure campaigns, debated or case-specific, the exact impact in some individual situations, how directly certain outcomes can be attributed to one program, and where Cointelpro ends, and the broader climate of law enforcement and politics begins. That distinction matters, because if you exaggerate everything, people can dismiss the whole story as paranoia. But if you stay with the documents, the story is already disturbing enough. The big picture is not seriously in doubt. Covert tools were used against Americans engaged in political activity. And that is the uncomfortable part, because Cointelpro destroys a comforting story Americans like to tell themselves, that abuses of power only happen somewhere else, or only during emergencies, or only to people who deserve it. The lesson is simpler than that. If institutions become secretive enough, frightened enough, and unchecked enough, dissent can start being treated as a threat. And once that happens, a filing cabinet becomes a political weapon. That is why this story still matters. Not because the 1960s were chaotic, not because the Cold War was tense, and not because every government investigation is automatically abuse. It matters because the pattern is reusable. A crisis, a fear, a secret file, a legal gray zone, a public that finds out too late. That is the warning. Democracy does not only depend on elections, it depends on limits, it depends on oversight, it depends on the right to criticize power without being quietly turned into a target. So when people talk about Cointelpro, the question is not only what happened back then. The question is what kind of system allows it to happen and what stops it from happening again. If you want more stories like this, documented history most people never learned properly, subscribe. No conspiracy tone, just receipts. This is Declassified America.